At my granddaughter's wedding, I looked down at my name tag and read 4 words that told me exactly what my family thought of me: the forgotten old lady. I smiled, pinned it to my dress, and walked inside as though nothing had happened. It wasn't because the words didn't hurt. It was because I had already learned that the loudest people in a room rarely notice the quiet person who still holds the truth. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed every sacrifice I had made for my family had meant something. The wedding was being held at a beautiful country club just outside Charleston, South Carolina. The early autumn air carried the scent of fresh flowers, and the white oak trees surrounding the ceremony space were wrapped in tiny strings of warm lights that would glow after sunset. Everything looked elegant, polished, and expensive. Guests laughed as waiters carried silver trays filled with sparkling cider and champagne. A string quartet rehearsed softly near the garden, and photographers hurried from one smiling face to another, capturing what everyone expected would become the perfect family memory. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready that morning. I chose a powder blue dress my late husband, Thomas, always said brought out the color of my eyes. I carefully fastened the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th wedding anniversary and slipped my wedding ring into my purse instead of wearing it. I still couldn't bring myself to leave it behind completely, even though Thomas had been gone for almost 3 years. Looking into the mirror before leaving home, I whispered the same words I always did whenever life asked more of me than I felt prepared to give. Just keep your dignity, Margaret. It had become something of a promise between the woman I used to be and the woman I was still trying to become. My granddaughter Olivia had invited more than 200 guests. Friends, business associates, distant relatives, neighbors, college classmates, and people I had never met all filled the beautifully decorated venue. She looked radiant in her designer gown, smiling for every camera, accepting every compliment as though she had been born for this very day. Watching her from a distance, I remembered the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder while I read bedtime stories after her mother worked late shifts at the hospital. I remembered scraped knees, piano recitals, school science fairs, homemade birthday cakes, and Christmas mornings when she insisted Grandma's cinnamon rolls tasted better than anyone else's. Those memories made it difficult to connect the smiling bride across the lawn with the little girl I had loved so completely. At the reception entrance, a young event coordinator greeted me warmly and searched through a neatly arranged collection of seating cards. "Mrs. Whitmore," she asked politely. "Here you are." She handed me the elegant white card with a cheerful smile before rushing to greet another arriving guest. I thanked her without looking down right away. It wasn't until I reached the large floral arrangement near the ballroom doors that curiosity made me glance at the card. Instead of seeing my name, I saw the words printed in graceful gold lettering, "The Forgotten Old Lady." For a brief second, every sound around me seemed to disappear. The music faded. The conversations blurred into silence. Even the laughter drifting through the open ballroom doors seemed impossibly far away. My fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the card. Then I inhaled slowly, straightened my shoulders, and pinned it to my dress exactly where everyone could see it. If someone wanted me to wear those words, I would let them. Sometimes the quickest way to discover someone's true character is to quietly accept the role they expect you to play. As I stepped into the ballroom, dozens of crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across perfectly arranged tables covered in ivory linen. Every centerpiece overflowed with white roses and eucalyptus. The room smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Everywhere I looked, people embraced one another, toasted the happy couple, and celebrated the beginning of a new chapter. No one noticed the elderly woman wearing a name tag that wasn't really a name at all. At least, not yet. And somewhere across the room, Olivia looked directly at me. Our eyes met for only a heartbeat before the corners of her mouth lifted into the faintest smile. It wasn't the smile of a loving granddaughter. It was the smile of someone quietly checking whether a carefully planned message had been delivered exactly as intended. I moved carefully through the ballroom, greeting familiar faces with the same quiet smile I had worn for decades. A few old neighbors recognized me immediately and complimented my dress. One elderly couple asked how I had been managing since Thomas passed away. I answered honestly enough to satisfy polite conversation without allowing the weight of loneliness to settle over the celebration. Grief teaches you strange manners. It teaches you how to smile while carrying memories no one else can see. As I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, I noticed several younger guests reading my name tag before quickly looking away. Some offered awkward smiles. Others whispered to one another, assuming I could not hear them. I did not blame them. If I had attended a wedding and seen an elderly woman wearing a badge that called her the forgotten old lady, I probably would have wondered whether it was some strange family joke as well. The difference was that I knew my family well enough to understand there are jokes that are designed to make everyone laugh, and there are jokes that exist only to remind one person exactly where they stand. My assigned table was tucked near the back corner of the reception hall, beside the service entrance where waiters moved constantly between the kitchen and the dining room. From my seat I had a perfect view of every guest, but very few people could easily see me. It was impossible not to notice that my son Daniel and his wife Caroline were seated near the dance floor with the bridal party. Olivia had carefully arranged every place card in this room. Nothing about the seating chart had happened by accident. I rested my purse on the empty chair beside me and slowly unfolded my linen napkin. Years ago, Thomas used to joke that no matter where we sat, I always found the best view because I preferred watching people over being watched myself. I smiled at the memory. He had always understood me better than anyone. The quartet finished playing, and soft applause spread across the room. Olivia and her new husband entered to enthusiastic cheers while cameras flashed from every direction. She looked perfectly composed, waving gracefully as though she had practiced every movement in front of a mirror. I applauded with everyone else. Love deserves celebration, even when the people celebrating have forgotten the ones who helped build the road that brought them there. As dinner was served, conversations filled the room with easy laughter. A gentleman sitting across from me introduced himself as one of the groom's business partners. His wife complimented the floral arrangements before her eyes drifted toward my name tag. She hesitated for only a second. "That is an unusual place card," she said gently. I smiled without embarrassment. "It certainly is memorable." She looked uncomfortable, perhaps expecting me to explain, but I simply picked up my fork and admired the beautifully prepared fillet of salmon resting beside roasted vegetables. Some questions deserve immediate answers. Others become far more meaningful when time provides them naturally. Across the ballroom I caught Olivia speaking animatedly with several bridesmaids. Every so often she glanced in my direction. Not openly. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough to confirm that I was still sitting exactly where she expected me to be. Watching quietly. Remaining silent. Wearing those 4 carefully chosen words like part of the evening's decorations. Daniel finally approached my table nearly 40 minutes after dinner began. He leaned down to kiss my cheek with the hurried affection of someone checking an item off a list. "Mom, everything all right?" he asked. "It is a beautiful wedding," I replied. He nodded quickly, relief passing across his face because I had not mentioned the name tag. His eyes dropped toward it anyway. For the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Then discomfort. Before I could say a word, Caroline called his name from across the room, and he excused himself with an apologetic smile. I watched him walk away, wondering whether he had seen those words for the first time or whether he had been pretending all evening that they were invisible. Sometimes silence protects the guilty more effectively than lies ever could. I remained at my table long after dessert was served, listening more than speaking. Families reveal themselves in ordinary conversations. They reveal themselves in who receives gratitude, who is overlooked, and who becomes convenient to forget once photographs have been taken. By the time the first dance ended and guests gathered around the polished dance floor, I had stopped wondering whether the name tag had been a mistake. The only question left was how many people already knew exactly why I was wearing it. I had just finished my coffee when the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage and welcomed everyone to the reception. His voice carried easily through the ballroom as guests settled into their seats, laughing and raising their glasses toward the newly married couple. The evening flowed exactly as Olivia had planned. Every light was perfectly placed. Every flower arrangement stood exactly where it belonged. Every detail reflected elegance and careful preparation. Then he smiled warmly and said, "Before dinner continues, let us take a moment to recognize some of the special people who helped shape today's beautiful bride." The room erupted into applause. Parents were introduced first, followed by the groom's family, godparents, childhood mentors, and close family friends. As each person stood, cameras turned toward them while guests clapped politely. I remained seated, quietly listening, never expecting my name to be mentioned. Olivia had made it clear long before that she preferred to present herself as someone who had achieved everything on her own. Then the master of ceremonies glanced down at his printed notes and smiled. "And we would also like to recognize." He paused for only a heartbeat before reading exactly what appeared on the card in front of him. "The forgotten old lady." A strange silence settled across the ballroom. At first, several guests laughed softly, assuming it must be some playful family nickname. Others hesitated, unsure whether they should clap. The young man on stage looked confused as his eyes searched the room. Following the seating chart provided by the wedding planner, he looked directly toward my table. "Would the forgotten old lady please stand?" Every conversation stopped. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me at the same moment. I felt the weight of every glance without lowering my own. Slowly, I rose from my chair, smoothed the front of my blue dress, and offered the same calm smile I had been wearing all evening. I did not speak. I did not correct him. None of this embarrassment belonged to the young man simply reading the information he had been given. Around me I heard scattered whispers growing louder with each passing second. "Is that really her name?" one woman asked quietly. "That cannot be right," her husband answered. Another guest frowned and looked toward the bridal table, obviously trying to understand what had just happened. The master of ceremonies quickly realized something was wrong. His smile faded. "I am terribly sorry," he said, lowering the microphone slightly. "There may have been a printing mistake." Before I could answer, Olivia laughed from the head table. It was not loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, but it was loud enough for the people seated nearby. "Grandma always says she gets forgotten at family events," she said with an easy shrug. We thought it would lighten the mood. A few uncertain chuckles followed her explanation, but they faded almost immediately. Good humor does not require explaining. Genuine kindness never leaves people wondering whether they should laugh. I looked toward Olivia. She smiled confidently, expecting me to rescue the moment the way I had rescued so many uncomfortable family gatherings over the years. She knew I disliked public conflict. She knew I usually protected everyone else's feelings before my own. What she did not realize was that silence can reveal far more than arguments ever could. I simply inclined my head toward the master of ceremonies and said, "Please continue. You have done nothing wrong." Relief washed over his face as he thanked me and returned to the schedule, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests were no longer focused entirely on the celebration. Their eyes wandered repeatedly toward my table and then back to Olivia. The questions had already begun forming in their minds. Why would a granddaughter label her own grandmother that way? Why had no one corrected it before now? Why did the elderly woman seem calmer than everyone else? As the speeches resumed, I noticed several people studying my name tag instead of listening to the wedding toasts. Even Daniel seemed unable to concentrate. He avoided looking in my direction altogether, choosing instead to stare into his untouched glass of iced tea. Caroline whispered something into his ear, and he answered with the smallest shake of his head. Whatever conversation they were having, neither of them appeared comfortable anymore. Sometimes the truth begins with a single uncomfortable moment that no amount of smiling can erase. The ballroom still sparkled beneath the chandeliers, the musicians still played softly, and dinner continued exactly as planned, but something invisible had changed. The flawless picture Olivia had worked so hard to create now contained one small crack, and everyone in the room had seen exactly where it began. I remained seated while the applause slowly returned, softer now, uncertain and restrained. The celebration continued around me, but my thoughts drifted somewhere far beyond the ballroom. It is remarkable how quickly the mind travels when the heart has been quietly wounded. One careless moment can awaken decades of memories that had been resting peacefully beneath the surface. As I watched Olivia laugh with her bridesmaids, I no longer saw the confident young woman in an expensive wedding gown. I saw the little girl who used to run barefoot through my backyard every summer, chasing butterflies with a mason jar in her tiny hands. After Daniel and Caroline both accepted demanding jobs, there were years when my house became Olivia's second home. Every weekday afternoon, the school bus dropped her at my front porch instead of her own. I helped with homework at the old oak kitchen table where Thomas had once taught Daniel long division. We baked chocolate chip cookies almost every Friday, and she insisted that the first warm cookie always belonged to Grandpa. When Thomas retired, he built a small wooden swing beneath the maple tree just because Olivia had once said the park swings were always too crowded. We did not think of those things as sacrifices. They were simply what family did for one another. When Olivia was 12 years old, she dreamed of attending a prestigious summer music program in North Carolina. Daniel worried about the tuition because business had been slow that year. I still remember Thomas looking across the dinner table before quietly reaching for our checkbook. We canceled the road trip we had been planning for months without saying a word to anyone. Olivia never knew that her violin lessons were paid for with money originally saved for our anniversary vacation. She returned home that summer glowing with confidence, carrying a certificate she proudly hung on our refrigerator before taking it to her own house. Thomas smiled every time he walked past it. He said investing in children was the only investment that always mattered. Years later, when Olivia was accepted into one of the best universities in the state, scholarships covered much of her education, but not all of it. Student housing, textbooks, meal plans, transportation, and countless unexpected expenses piled up faster than Daniel anticipated. Thomas and I met with our financial advisor and quietly withdrew money from an investment account we had hoped would make retirement more comfortable. We never announced what we had done. We never expected gratitude. We simply believed that helping family build a future was more meaningful than adding numbers to a bank statement. After Thomas passed away, I found a handwritten notebook inside the top drawer of his desk. He had always enjoyed keeping careful records, not because he loved money, but because he believed every dollar should reflect a purpose. Between pages listing charitable donations and household repairs were small notes about Olivia. Violin tuition. College books. Emergency car repair during sophomore year. Security deposit. For first apartment. Even a contribution toward graduate school applications. Beside one of the final entries, Thomas had written a single sentence in his neat handwriting. One day she will understand that love is measured by quiet choices. I remember tracing those words with my fingertips while tears blurred the page. I believed he was right. I believed maturity would eventually reveal the value of all the invisible moments that built a person's life. Sitting alone in the ballroom, I wondered if understanding sometimes arrives too late. The wedding decorations surrounding me were beautiful because hundreds of small details had been carefully arranged. Families are built the same way. Not through one grand gesture, but through thousands of ordinary acts that no one applauds. Early mornings driving children to school. Long evenings waiting in emergency rooms when fevers refused to break. Birthday cakes baked after exhausting workdays. Graduation gifts quietly purchased instead of replacing an aging roof. Those moments disappear so easily because they become part of someone's normal life. People remember receiving far more often than they remember being given to. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Olivia was posing for another round of photographs beneath a floral arch, smiling effortlessly while guests admired the celebration she had created. Watching her, I realized something that surprised even me. I did not feel anger. I felt sadness for a young woman who believed dignity could be borrowed by taking it away from someone else. Thomas often said that character reveals itself most clearly when there is nothing left to gain. As I looked around the ballroom, I began to wonder how many people here were finally seeing not only who I truly was, but who Olivia had quietly become. And although she did not know it yet, the evening was only beginning to uncover truths that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I was reaching for my handbag when I noticed Harold Collins standing quietly near the entrance to the terrace. He had been my family's attorney for more than 30 years, beginning long before Daniel married Caroline or Olivia was even born. Harold had attended countless holiday dinners at our home, celebrated Thomas's retirement with us, and stood beside me at the cemetery on the cold November morning when we buried my husband. He was not simply a lawyer. He was one of the few people still alive who remembered the life Thomas and I had built from the very beginning. Our eyes met across the ballroom. He did not wave. He simply gave the smallest nod, as though asking whether I might have a few private minutes to spare. I excused myself from my table and stepped through the glass doors onto the terrace overlooking the golf course. The evening air was cool and carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Inside, music and conversation continued, softened by the closed doors behind us until they sounded like distant echoes. Harold folded his hands in front of him and looked at me with genuine concern. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "You have done nothing that requires one." He sighed. "Perhaps not directly. But I should have spoken sooner." For a moment neither of us said anything. Harold had always believed silence should never be rushed. Finally he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a folded sheet of ivory paper. He did not hand it to me immediately. Instead, he asked a question that caught me completely by surprise. "Did anyone tell you that the place cards were printed twice?" I frowned. "Printed twice?" He nodded. "The original set listed every guest by name. Those were approved nearly 3 weeks ago." A quiet chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "What happened to them?" Harold looked back through the ballroom windows before lowering his voice. 3 days ago, Olivia personally requested several changes. She told the event planner she wanted to add personal touches for close family members. I did not interrupt him. Somehow I already knew what he was about to say. The planner believed the requests came with everyone's approval. The original cards were discarded, and new ones were printed. Harold finally handed me the folded paper. It was a copy of the original. Seating list. My name appeared exactly as it should have. Margaret Whitmore. Table 9. Nothing unusual. Nothing humorous. Nothing cruel. I stared at the page for several long seconds before carefully folding it again. The strange thing was that I did not feel shocked anymore. Deep inside, I think my heart had already accepted the truth hours earlier. Harold spoke again, choosing each word with obvious care. The young man who introduced the family members was reading directly from the revised seating list. He had no idea those words were not your chosen designation. I nodded slowly. I could see that. "Margaret," he continued, "I asked the event coordinator about the change after I noticed your badge. She was horrified. She assumed it had been an inside family joke." He paused before adding, "She also told me Olivia insisted that no one alter the final version under any circumstances." The confirmation settled over me with remarkable calm. There would be no comforting explanation. No printing error. No misunderstanding. No mischievous child making a careless decision. Every letter had been intentional. Every glance across the ballroom had been calculated. Every smile had been a quiet check to see whether the humiliation was unfolding exactly as planned. Harold studied my face carefully. "You are taking this better than I expected." I looked toward the ballroom where Olivia was laughing beside the wedding cake while photographers captured another perfect moment. "No," I answered gently. "I am simply seeing things more clearly than I ever have before." Harold followed my gaze. "Thomas worried this day might come." I turned toward him immediately. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, almost as though weighing whether this conversation should continue tonight. During the last year of his life, he noticed changes in the family. Small things. Conversations about money. Questions about investments that seemed unusually persistent. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing, but he believed character often reveals itself when people begin expecting an inheritance before they have experienced enough gratitude. I felt my throat tighten at the mention of Thomas. Even now, years after losing him, hearing someone speak his name with affection always stirred something deep inside me. Harold placed a reassuring hand over mine for only a brief moment. He asked me to be patient. He believed the truth always arrives on its own schedule. I slipped the folded guest list carefully into my handbag without another word. Beyond the terrace doors, the celebration continued beneath sparkling chandeliers and smiling faces. Inside that ballroom, Olivia still believed she controlled every detail of the evening. She believed the story had already been written. What she could not possibly know was that the first real chapter had only just begun, and the person who understood that better than anyone had been quietly preparing for this moment long before tonight ever arrived. I returned to the ballroom with the same steady pace I had used all evening. Nothing about my expression had changed, and that was exactly how I wanted it. There is a certain kind of strength that comes from refusing to let someone else decide how your story will be remembered. As I walked past the dance floor, several guests smiled politely. A few of them looked at my name tag again before quickly looking away, embarrassed on my behalf. Their discomfort told me something important. Kind people instinctively recognize cruelty even when it is wrapped in expensive decorations and polite laughter. I resumed my seat at table 9 and took another sip of the sparkling water that had long since lost its bubbles. Across the room, the band transitioned into softer music while servers quietly cleared dessert plates from the tables. The reception had settled into that comfortable stage where conversations became more personal and guests relaxed after the formalities. Olivia moved gracefully from table to table thanking everyone for attending. She looked every bit the confident bride she had imagined herself to be. Every few minutes she glanced toward me, perhaps expecting tears, anger, or a dramatic confrontation. I offered her none of those things. Instead, whenever our eyes met, I smiled warmly enough to leave her uncertain. Confusion is often far more unsettling than open conflict. Eventually she made her way to my table. Her new husband excused himself to greet another group of relatives, leaving the two of us alone for the first time that evening. "Grandma," she said sweetly, smoothing the fabric of her gown, "I hope you are having a nice time." Her voice was flawless. Anyone listening would have believed she was the picture of a devoted granddaughter. I folded my hands neatly on the table. "It has certainly been a memorable evening." She laughed softly, though I noticed the slightest hesitation behind her eyes. "About the place card. I hope you know it was only meant to be playful." I studied her face for a long moment before answering. "Interesting. I have always believed that good humor makes everyone smile, not just one person." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "People are probably taking it more seriously than they should." "Perhaps," I replied calmly. "Or perhaps people understand more than we give them credit for." Before she could respond, another guest approached to congratulate the newlyweds, and Olivia excused herself with visible relief. I watched her disappear into another circle of smiling faces. She had expected an argument she could dismiss as oversensitivity. Instead, she had received quiet answers that offered her nothing to defend against. Daniel appeared a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me before sitting in the empty chair beside mine. For several seconds he simply stared at the dance floor. Finally he spoke without looking at me. "Mom. I should have noticed the card sooner." His voice carried genuine regret, but regret often arrives after silence has already done its damage. "You did notice it," I answered gently. "Just not soon enough to ask why." He lowered his head. "I thought maybe everyone was in on the joke except me." I looked at my son, seeing not only the middle-aged businessman before me but also the little boy who used to run into my kitchen after baseball practice asking whether there were still homemade cookies left. Somewhere along the years he had begun avoiding difficult conversations because they felt inconvenient. "Daniel," I said quietly, "there are moments when saying nothing becomes a decision of its own." He closed his eyes briefly before whispering, "I know." Neither of us spoke after that. There are conversations that require hundreds of words, and others that reveal everything through silence. After a few moments he stood, squeezed my shoulder gently, and walked back toward Caroline, whose worried expression suggested she had been watching us from across the room. Harold passed by my table once more, saying nothing as he adjusted the cuff of his jacket. The brief glance we exchanged was enough. We both understood that nothing needed to happen tonight before the right moment arrived. Thomas had always believed patience was wasted only on people who demanded immediate satisfaction. The orchestra began another slow melody as guests gathered closer to the dance floor. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light, and laughter once again drifted through the ballroom. To anyone arriving at that moment, the reception would have appeared flawless. Yet beneath the polished surface, something irreversible had already begun. The carefully crafted illusion of a perfect family was quietly unraveling thread by thread, and the people responsible had not even realized that the strongest person in the room was no longer trying to protect the image they had worked so hard to preserve. I remained where I was while the band invited everyone to gather for the next round of speeches. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, leaving the dance floor glowing beneath the crystal chandeliers. Waiters quietly refilled glasses, photographers adjusted their cameras, and conversations softened into an attentive murmur. It was remarkable how quickly people could return to celebration after witnessing something uncomfortable. Perhaps that is one of the ways we protect ourselves. We convince ourselves that silence restores normalcy, even when the truth has already entered the room. Harold slowly approached my table once more, this time carrying a slim leather portfolio beneath his arm. He asked politely if he might borrow a chair for a moment, and I nodded. To anyone watching, we appeared to be discussing ordinary legal matters, the sort of quiet conversation that naturally happens between an attorney and a longtime client. Harold leaned forward just enough to keep our voices private. "Margaret," he said softly, "I believe it is time for you to know everything Thomas asked me to protect." I folded my hands together and listened. Several months before his passing, Thomas updated more than his will. He also established a family trust designed to preserve certain assets for future generations. I looked at Harold without speaking. He continued carefully. The trust was never intended to reward entitlement. Thomas wanted it to encourage character, responsibility, and respect for family. He insisted on adding one final provision after noticing changes in the family's priorities. I remembered the quiet evenings during Thomas's illness when he spent hours reviewing paperwork in his study. Whenever I asked whether I should be worried, he always smiled and said, "I am simply making tomorrow easier for you." At the time, I believed he was only organizing financial records. I had no idea he had been preparing for something much deeper. Harold opened the portfolio just enough to remove a single sealed envelope. My name appeared across the front in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters after so many years caught me completely off guard. For a brief moment, the ballroom disappeared again, replaced by memories of Thomas sitting at his old mahogany desk with reading glasses balanced low on his nose. Harold placed the envelope gently into my hands but did not ask me to open it. His instructions were very specific, he explained. This letter was only to be given to you if there came a day when someone within the family deliberately chose humiliation over gratitude. My fingers rested lightly against the envelope. I did not break the seal. Somehow it felt as though Thomas was still beside me, asking me to wait just a little longer. Harold lowered his voice even further. "There is something else you should know. The trust cannot be fully distributed until you personally approve the final beneficiary certification." I looked up. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Harold answered calmly, "that despite what some members of the family may believe, no inheritance connected to that trust becomes final without your written authorization." Thomas wanted to make certain that the person who spent a lifetime protecting this family would never lose her voice after he was gone. I remained silent while those words settled into my heart. It was never about the money. Thomas understood that better than anyone. It was about responsibility. About ensuring that kindness would never be mistaken for weakness. Harold continued, "No one except you and I knows the complete language of that provision. Daniel understands only the general structure. Olivia has never seen the confidential section. Across the ballroom, Olivia raised another toast with several friends. She laughed freely, completely unaware that the future she believed had already been secured was resting behind the sealed envelope now lying quietly in my hands. Harold closed the portfolio and stood. "I am not asking you to make any decisions tonight," he said. "Thomas specifically instructed me never to influence your judgment. He trusted your heart more than anyone else's." Before leaving, he added one final sentence. He also wrote that true character often reveals itself when people believe there will be no consequences. After Harold walked away, I slipped the envelope carefully into my handbag beside the original guest list. 2 pieces of paper rested together. One represented who my family wanted the world to believe I had become. The other carried the final words of the man who had known me better than anyone ever would. Around me, guests applauded as another speech concluded. The newlyweds smiled beneath the warm lights while photographers captured yet another perfect image. Looking around the ballroom, I realized something profound. Every beautiful photograph taken tonight would preserve smiling faces, elegant flowers, and expensive decorations. None of them would capture the choices people had made when they believed no one important was watching. But Thomas had been watching long before this evening, and through the quiet wisdom he left behind, he had made certain that the truth would eventually find its own moment to stand in the light. The evening moved naturally toward its final celebration as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to gather their glasses for the couple's closing toast. Crystal reflected the warm light overhead while conversation settled into a respectful hush. Olivia and her husband stood together beneath the floral arch, smiling as though the entire day had unfolded exactly according to plan. I remained seated for a few moments longer, my handbag resting beside me, Thomas's sealed letter safely inside. I thought about everything that had happened since I walked through those ballroom doors. The name tag. The whispers. Daniel's silence. Harold's quiet honesty. None of it had happened by accident. Yet neither had the life Thomas and I spent building before this evening ever existed. I slowly rose from my chair, smoothed my dress, and walked toward Harold. He understood without a single word. Together we approached the edge of the dance floor just as the applause faded. The master of ceremonies noticed us immediately and smiled politely. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said into the microphone, "would you like to say a few words to the happy couple?" Every face in the ballroom turned toward me once again. Earlier that evening those same faces had watched me stand while carrying a name that was never mine. This time the room felt completely different. I accepted the microphone with steady hands and smiled first at the bride and groom before looking across the guests. "Thank you," I began softly. A wedding is one of the rare occasions where a family gathers not only to celebrate love, but also to remember the people whose quiet sacrifices made today possible. The ballroom became completely silent. When children are young, they rarely notice who wakes up early to drive them to school, who helps with homework after long workdays, who quietly pays for opportunities they cannot yet understand, or who gives up dreams so someone else may chase theirs. That is perfectly natural. Children are not expected to see everything. But adults eventually have a choice. They may remember with gratitude, or they may remember only themselves. I paused briefly before removing the name tag from my dress. Holding it between my fingers, I looked at it one final time. Tonight I was introduced by these words. I turned the card toward the audience so nearby guests could clearly read it. A ripple of uneasy silence spread through the room. I chose not to remove it because sometimes allowing people to witness the truth is more powerful than arguing against it. I gently placed the card on the nearby sweetheart table without anger or theatricality. I have never believed that dignity comes from embarrassing another person. I believe dignity comes from keeping your own, even when someone tries to take it away. I handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies before turning toward Harold. He stepped forward only after I gave the smallest nod. His calm voice carried easily throughout the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting the celebration. My name is Harold Collins, and I served as legal counsel for Thomas Whitmore for many years. Mrs. Whitmore has asked only that I clarify one misunderstanding. Olivia's confident smile slowly faded as Harold continued. Thomas Whitmore established a family trust before his passing. Many assumptions have been made regarding its future administration. Those assumptions are incomplete. Under the trust documents, no final certification of beneficiaries may occur without the written authorization of Margaret Whitmore. That requirement remains fully in effect. The ballroom fell into complete silence. Harold offered no dramatic explanation beyond those simple facts. He merely nodded respectfully and stepped back. I could feel dozens of eyes moving from him to me, then toward Olivia and Daniel. No one spoke. There was nothing to argue with. Nothing had been accused. Nothing had been exaggerated. A simple legal truth had quietly replaced an evening built upon false confidence. Olivia looked first toward Daniel, then toward Caroline, searching their faces for reassurance they could not give her. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time all evening, the carefully practiced smile disappeared from Olivia's face entirely. I walked toward her without rushing. When I reached the sweetheart table, I picked up the place card once more and placed it gently beside her bouquet. My voice remained warm and steady. Keep this if you wish. One day it may remind you that titles given to others often reveal far more about the person who created them. I squeezed her hand gently, not as punishment, not as forgiveness, but as a final reminder that family is always given one last opportunity to choose who they want to become. Then I turned away while the ballroom remained wrapped in thoughtful silence, leaving behind not anger or humiliation, but a truth that no photograph taken that evening would ever be able to hide. The ballroom remained unusually quiet for several long moments after I walked away from the sweetheart table. No one rushed to fill the silence because there are moments when words only make the truth harder to hear. I returned to my seat, picked up my handbag, and slipped the sealed letter from Thomas into my hands. For the first time that evening, I opened it. His handwriting was as steady and familiar as I remembered. My dearest Margaret, it began, if you are reading this, then someone we loved has confused kindness with weakness. I hope I am wrong, but if I am not, remember this above everything else. Never allow another person's disappointment to become your bitterness. Wealth can rebuild houses. It cannot rebuild character. If those who come after us forget gratitude, let life become their teacher instead of your anger. I read those words twice before carefully folding the letter and returning it to its envelope. I could almost hear Thomas speaking them across our kitchen table with the quiet confidence that had carried us through 46 years of marriage. He had never believed that revenge healed people. He believed truth did. Harold walked over one last time and asked softly whether I was ready to leave. I smiled. Yes, I answered. I think I have stayed exactly as long as I was supposed to. As we made our way toward the ballroom doors, Daniel hurried after me. His face looked older than it had only a few hours earlier. Mom, please wait. I stopped and turned toward him. For a moment he struggled to find the right words. Finally he said, I should have stood beside you the moment I saw that card. I kept telling myself it was not the right time to make a scene, but the truth is that I was afraid of making things uncomfortable. I reached up and gently straightened his crooked tie the same way I had done before his high school graduation many years ago. Doing the right thing rarely arrives at a convenient moment, I said quietly. But you still have time to become the man your father believed you were. Tears gathered in his eyes as he nodded. He did not ask about the trust. He did not ask about money. For the first time in many years, he seemed to understand that our conversation had never really been about either of those things. A few steps farther ahead, Olivia stood waiting near the entrance. The confidence that had surrounded her all evening was gone. She looked at me with uncertainty rather than pride. Grandma, she whispered, I thought it was only a joke. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. No, Olivia. The card was only paper. The choice behind it was what mattered. She lowered her eyes. I am sorry. Those words were quiet, imperfect, and perhaps incomplete, but they were spoken without an audience to impress. I nodded gently. Then spend the rest of your life proving those words are true. Apologies open doors. Character is what walks through them. I placed my hand lightly against her shoulder for only a moment before continuing toward the exit. Outside, the night air felt wonderfully cool after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. The stars stretched across the South Carolina sky with the same quiet certainty they had every night of my life, reminding me how small one painful evening truly was when measured against a lifetime of love. Harold offered to walk me to my car, but I told him I wanted a few moments alone. He understood immediately. I stood beside my sedan and looked back through the ballroom windows. Music had started again. Guests were slowly returning to their conversations. Life, as it always does, was moving forward. A few weeks later, Daniel came to my house alone. We spent an entire afternoon talking honestly for the first time in years. Months after that, Olivia visited without cameras, without expensive gifts, and without excuses. She asked if we could bake chocolate chip cookies together the way we used to. We did. She burned the first batch because she forgot to set the timer, and for the first time in a very long while, we laughed together without pretending. The trust remained exactly as Thomas designed it, but before signing anything, I asked only one thing of my family. I wanted them to volunteer together for a local community center every month for an entire year. I wanted the next generation to learn that giving means far more than receiving. Harold smiled when he read my decision because he said it sounded exactly like something Thomas would have chosen himself. Looking back now, I no longer remember that evening as the night I was forgotten. I remember it as the night every hidden truth finally stepped into the light. A printed card tried to define my worth in 4 careless words, but a lifetime of quiet love proved that no piece of paper can erase the value of a heart that has spent decades putting family before itself. In the end, I did not leave that wedding carrying humiliation. I left carrying peace, because I finally understood something Thomas had known all along. The people who remember kindness become rich in ways no inheritance can ever measure.